Well, good afternoon or good evening, and welcome to the second in this series of Tanner lectures. My name is David Kennedy. I'm on the committee that has the honor of selecting the Tanner lecturers, and I'm very happy to welcome you all here this evening. I'm going to presume that most, if not all of you, were here last evening, so don't need a full repetition of the very full introduction that John Hennessy gave for Nicholas Lemon last evening. But suffice it to say in my own case that I've known Nick's work for a long time. The first of his books that I encountered was The Promised Land. And we got to know each other reasonably well over a period of several years when we both served, as it happened, on the board of the Pulitzer Prizes. Nick was an ex officio member with vote, as I recollect, or you didn't have a vote? Okay. The president of Columbia was ex officio with vote, but you were ex officio without vote. But nonetheless, even though he didn't have a vote, or maybe because he didn't have a vote, on that board over 9 years of every year talking through the awarding of 21 different prizes, 14 in journalism, 7 in arts and letters, Nick's was consistently among the most judicious and incisive voices around that table where we had those discussions. So we were very fortunate last evening to hear that voice. Give us a kind of a tour d'horizon of some of the major pieces of social commentary in the post-World War II era. We had a lot of exposure last evening to David Reesman and David Truman, but also cameo appearances at least by William White, C. Wright Mills, John Kenneth Galbraith, and Betty Friedan, whom Nick used to construct what he called, I'm paraphrasing him, of course, the organizational paradigm that was so conspicuous in American social thought and commentary in that period. Over last evening and this morning, I was reflecting that all of those authors, and indeed Nick himself, by taking them on, they all stand in a grand tradition of American social commentary that stretches back at least to Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s. And having mentioned Tocqueville, I can't resist quoting him, particularly on a point that Nick dwelled on last evening, and I believe you'll return to this evening, about the matter of individualism. Individualism is actually a word that Alexis de Tocqueville coined. It entered our vocabulary thanks to him, and when he coined the term, he thought he was employing it to describe a social or psychological type that he thought was characteristic of American society, or more broadly, of democratic societies. He said, straight out, he said, individualism is of democratic origin. And then what I have always found a particularly moving passage, he said the following. He said, amongst democratic nations, new families are constantly springing up, others are constantly falling away, and all that remain change their condition. The woof of time is every instant broken, and the track of generations effaced. Those who went before are soon forgotten. Of those who will come after, no one has any idea. The interest of man is confined to those in close propinquity to himself. As each class approximates to other classes and intermingles with them, its members become indifferent and as strangers to one another. Thus, not only does democracy make every man forget his ancestors, but it hides his descendants and separates his contemporaries from him. It throws him back forever upon himself alone, and threatens in the end to confine him entirely within the solitude of his own heart. Poetic, but I think terribly insightful then, 170 or 80 years ago, no less than it is today. And again, I'm further compelled to reflect that some of our greatest novelists in the American canon have worked the same theme about the quest or struggle of isolated individuals to find an identity in a society that does not assign them ascriptive identities. It's a theme as old at least as Benjamin Franklin, but think of Theodore Dreiser's Sister Carrie, or F. Scott Fitzgerald's Jay Gatsby, or Philip Roth's Swede Lvov. They're all characters squarely in an American imaginative tradition, which I think is closely associated with the tradition of social commentary that Nick is exploring. A lot of the one of the underlying questions here, I think, is do such commentaries, as we heard about last evening, and we're about to hear some more about tonight, do those commentaries and novels like the ones I just mentioned, do they merely reflect the reality of our society's situation over time, or are those perceptions themselves agents that shape the way we understand and act within our social reality. Tonight, Nick Lemmon is going to shift from his description of the organizational paradigm that was so conspicuous, as I said, in the years after World War II, to what he calls the transactional paradigm that describes our society today. You're going to hear some more names I happen to know. Moncur Olson, Theodore Lowy, John Rawls, George Packer, Charles Murray amongst them. And before I hand the baton to Nick, I just want to share with you some polling data that recently came to my attention about institutions, which is, of course, Nick's central subject, and how we as a people have lost confidence in virtually all of our major institutions over the last generation or two. So here's the question asked by the Gallup organization every year since the 1970s down through 2013. They have asked a sample, how much confidence do you have in institution X? And those answering that question either as a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in the institutions, the data look like this. I'm going to conflate the 1970s because in fact the data are gathered in slightly different years, but that's not really material here. So in the 1970s, 45% of us, 45%, still a minority, interesting, had confidence in the Supreme Court. Today it's 34%. 1970s, 68% of Americans reported a great deal of confidence in churches and organized religion. Today it's 44%. Public schools, 58% in the 1970s, 29% today. The criminal justice system, 56% in the 1970s, 28% today. Banks, 60% in the 1970s, 26% today. Newspapers, 51% in the 70s, 23% today. The Congress, 42% in the 1970s and 10% today. There's one exception to this pattern, and it's a very interesting exception, maybe the subject for another discussion on another occasion, the military. The military received high confidence ratings from 58% of those polled in the 70s and 76% today. It's the only institution amongst the profile of major institutions in our society in which we have more confidence than we did then, something to reflect on. Beginning in 2001, the Gallup organization added a question to these polls. They asked the same question, how much confidence do you have in the American people? And when they first started polling in 2001, the answer was 74% had confidence. Today it's 61%. So not only have we lost confidence in some of our major institutions, according to these data at least, we've lost confidence in ourselves. So it's another matter worth pondering, and with that I will pass the baton to Nick Lemmon.
Thanks, David. Thanks, David. That's a not just generous but very interesting introduction. And I have to say, since you mentioned Swede Lvov, he's the hero of, or anti-hero of a book called American Pastoral by Philip Roth. That following Philip Roth's career over the years makes one see that as the years go by, you become perhaps more appreciative of institutions and less appreciative of letting individualism flower maximally. That may have happened to me too, but I think this is just completely fact-based. But just to say, I also want to say at the outset again how grateful I am for this invitation. Josh Ferris, one of our commenters tomorrow, said after our session this morning, you know, I'm amazed that this kind of thing goes on around the work of writers. For us who, I was not in a university till I was 48 years old, you take it for granted if you're in a university to live in an atmosphere of critique with colleagues and even superiors. Sometimes it's exercises like this. Sometimes it's Bairn's PowerPoints over in the computer science building. But those of us who are kind of out there in the world on our own really don't get that, and it's an incredible gift as you're working your way through a complicated theme to have this kind of feedback. I started pretty much by accident having this happen occasionally in my life in universities 25, 30 years ago. And it was so rewarding. That's one of the reasons I wanted to leave what I had been doing and situate myself in a university, a decision that almost all of my friends thought was insane at the time, although the wisdom has become clearer over the years. So again, thank you, and I also appreciate just being able to talk about serious ideas before a sizable audience, which is a rare privilege. Okay, I want to confess that I've been feeling a twinge of guilt about these lectures because I imagine that when I was invited to give them, the expectation at Stanford might have been that my subject would be journalism. Just a few months ago, I came to the end of a 10-year term as Dean of Columbia Journalism School, and it turned out that my time in that job was a period of enormous change in my profession as the internet began making its full effects felt. Journalism is an essential realm in a free society, and it would be reasonable to expect that I would have something to say about its condition and its prospects. The problem is that as a journalism school dean, one has a great many opportunities to say a few words about the state of journalism. So many that, I will now confess, one can get a little weary of hearing oneself talk about the state of journalism. Your invitation coincided not only with the end of my term, but also with a post-decanal year off. So I decided to use the gift of time from Columbia and the gift of an invitation from Stanford to explore a new subject rather than to reflect on a familiar one. But there is a connection between what I've been doing these last 10 years and the topic of these lectures. Journalism, at least institutionalized journalism in the late 20th century, seems to me to have been an example, one of many possible, of the unofficial but powerful American social compact of that era that I discussed in the previous lecture. News was a private business, heavily regulated in the case of broadcast journalism, lightly regulated in the case of newspapers, that was expected to take on a range of broad social missions. These included, inside each news organization, providing the kind of benefits, employment security, and retirement benefits that were standard items in corporate America in those days, and also, in the name of public service, undertaking a set of journalistic activities that were not economically rational, but that the better big newspapers did anyway, such as investigative reporting, international reporting, and detailed coverage of state and local government. Seeing these informal but permanent-seeming arrangements, both the economic ones and the journalistic ones, disappear quite rapidly in response to severe economic pressure, led me to wonder how significant a part of American life such arrangements had been in other fields, and what their dissolution, evidently forever, might mean for our society. In other words, can what happened in the last decade in journalism be understood as an especially dramatic example of a broader phenomenon that bears consideration? And I don't even need to say, but I will. At least among my friends in journalism, I have a lot of conversations now that I'm in a university under the heading of "You're next, buddy." And as you know, there's whether it's true or not, a lot of talk about universities as institutions being pulled apart into component parts, economically rationalized more than they are, et cetera. Some people advocating this, some people worrying about this. Just to stay on this for one point, there's really two kinds of social functions that at institutions that are not, purely on mission, perhaps, that I want you to think about. One is this sort of welfare state function that many private big organizations in the United States at least used to take on, partly because the state did not. And of course, universities still do pretty much shoulder that burden, but a lot of places don't. And the other is the ability to conduct many different activities under one roof, so that some activities that are socially useful but would have a very hard time standing out on the prairie amid the howling winds, like running a major research library, get to happen inside institutions. And in journalism, what we've seen is when you pick apart all the functions and take out the distribution function and take out, take each article and give it a separate economic life, those kinds of activities show themselves as inefficient and then disappear. So that not happening is a reason to feel sort of preservationist toward institutions, at least in my mind. Before I became a dean, I was a working journalist for decades, producing mostly magazine articles and books. In my way, I was a transaction person, even though I wasn't engaged in financial transactions. I would get an assignment, go somewhere, gather as much information as I could in a limited time, and develop an idea about a situation I was covering. The more dramatic the idea, the better. Then, having published my story and left it to my subject to enact my findings, it was off to the next assignment, in which I would pronounce judgment on another previously unfamiliar realm. Some of you may have been subjected to either myself personally or my colleagues doing this exercise. And I was so socialized this way that when I first started talking to my boss at Columbia, Lee Bollinger, about journalism education, I said to him, why don't I just write you a memo about what should happen at the journalism school over the next 10 years, and then just go back to what I was doing? And he said, well, it'll only happen if you write the memo and then implement the memo, which was a kind of wake-up call to me that might seem obvious to most of you. I had the characteristic lack of respect bordering on contempt of my generation and my profession for organizations and bureaucracies. But, and I know this is comically predictable, as soon as I became a dean, I developed a strange new respect for large institutions and for the people who choose to devote their main energies to administering them. At least the better established universities, as you know, have been more able than many large businesses to maintain the welfare state aspects of American organizational life, though that may now be eroding. They can, as large news organizations used to be able to, charge their customers a single high price that covers a very wide range of aggregated activities, some of which could not survive without this kind of economic protection. They have elaborate structures of rules, procedures, committees, rituals, and so on that can often make daily life frustrating, especially for deans, but that help protect people without power from being treated capriciously while preserving the power of the institution to avoid disintermediation. As an administrator, I was an instant convert to pluralism because it's impossible to operate in a university environment without dealing with groups and trying to devise negotiated solutions to their conflicting claims. One cannot simply order everyone to follow one goal that is impervious to modification, a stricture that most of my old transaction person friends assume wrongly to amount to a crippling managerial disadvantage. Universities yet can and do change quite a lot over time. So now, in thinking about institutions in society more broadly and rigorously, I'm trying to figure out how much of the appreciation for institutions I've developed is merely personal sentiment and how much has wider implications. In The Modern Corporation and Private Property, which I discussed a lot last night, Adolph Burley and Gardner Means spend a good 160 pages, close to half the book, laying out in detail exactly how control of the corporation passed from the shareholders to the management during the early decades of the 20th century. This entailed enumerating a list of technical changes engineered by Wall Street corporate and securities lawyers, none of which attracted public notice at the time, and you can see why. Even in the author's literarily capable hands, this part of the book is a real struggle to get through. Burley and Means argue persuasively that these changes, taken together, added up to a significant rearrangement of American society. In fact, as I mentioned last night, there are authors who like to make a very large claim. They said it was a significant rearrangement of human society. The large change that I've been discussing, away from institutions and toward transactions, away from corporations and toward the financial markets, was put into effect through a similar long series of specific, undramatic policy changes at the end of the 20th century. It's usually very difficult for electoral politics, journalism, or public opinion to register the magnitude of such changes as they are occurring. That is partly because they're difficult to understand, partly because they often sound like sensible reforms that no one could possibly object to, and partly because they lack the feeling of a consequential event that, say, an election night has. In this talk, sorry to disappoint you, but I don't have time to go into full detail about the building blocks that created the edifice of our transaction-oriented society. But I'll mention just a few of them just to give you the flavor. These examples will all be from the financial world. In 1974, and you note that I'm sort of picking up exactly where I ended the pure realm of intellectual history last night. In 1974, Congress passed the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA, which was meant to protect employees from underfunded company pension plans after there had been some scandals about that. That led to substantial increases in the capital held within corporate pension funds and invested in the financial markets. Deep within that law and subsequent regulations issued by the Labor Department was a revision of something called the Prudent Man Rule, which dates all the way back to 1830 and says essentially these funds can only be invested as a prudent man would invest them. The change allowed pension funds and endowments to invest some of their funds at a higher level of risk, for example, in low-grade bonds, so-called junk bonds, and leverage buyouts. Also in 1974, the Securities and Exchange Commission abolished fixed commissions on stock trades, which lowered the cost of trading and therefore enormously increased the volume. In 1978, Congress created the now ubiquitous 401k pension plans, which signaled a massive shift from defined benefit to defined contribution pensions and transferred control of capital from corporations to financial firms. The rise of both corporate and individual pensions as major players in the markets, which led Peter Drucker to announce in a 1976 book that the United States had become a socialist country because the workers, meaning pension funds, now controlled the means of production, meaning equity ownership in corporations. And that helped ring down the curtain on the Burley and Means model of corporate control. Trades by individuals in specific stocks and bonds were on their way to becoming an insignificant part of market activity. Ownership had effectively moved into the hands of big institutional investors who were not hesitant to exercise their power, which meant it was no longer so widely distributed, their power that is, or so completely divorced from control. In part because of the influence of Michael Jensen and William Meckling's work, management was more likely to be paid substantially in the form of stock options, so executives began thinking more like owners too. The most celebrated chief executive of a traditional big corporation in the late 20th century was probably Jack Welch of General Electric, and what he was celebrated for was rigorously privileging the interest of shareholders over those of employees. And although Drucker's observation was facile, it was in fact ironic that pensions and endowments, like Stanford's, in seeking higher returns for their generally liberal constituents, became a source of pressure against the shareholder-ignoring generosity of the old corporate welfare state. In 1980, Congress passed the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act, which was the beginning of the end of the long era in which banks were forbidden to pay interest on checking accounts, and savings and loan companies were permitted to pay only strictly limited government-set interest on their deposits. This put pressure on traditional financial institutions to make their money on riskier activities because they no longer had a government-guaranteed way to make a profit on their deposits. It also led to enormous flows of ordinary American savings out of banks and into money market funds and other instruments that invested in the financial markets, which meant that big businesses' capital now came more from empowered return-seeking investors and less from traditional bank loans. And that too, that is, being unable to make a lot of money making traditional bank loans, helped push banks into investing and trading themselves. In 1984, Congress passed the Secondary Mortgage Market Enhancement Act, which was an important step in the process of permitting financial institutions to buy up home mortgages, bundle them into investment vehicles, have them blessed by rating agencies, and sell them to the public. Mortgage-backed securities were, of course, only one example of a wide range of new financial products, options, derivatives, index funds, swaps, straddles, and so on, that were enabled by the work of mathematically oriented economists and advances in information processing technology, as well as by deregulation. In 1994, Congress passed the Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act, which was the final nail in the coffin of the historic ban on interstate banking. It was in the years just after this that financial entities like Chase and Bank of America made their first appearance on lists of the country's biggest corporations. Chase's assets grew almost 20-fold between 1995 and 2013. Its profit last year was about 7 times, which was slightly down, by the way, was about 7 times the combined profits of all 50 of the largest American commercial banks, including Chase itself, in 1975. That same year, 1994, the 87-month-long Uruguay round of the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade negotiations concluded with the creation of the World Trade Association, which was a crucial step in the process we call globalization. And of course, as production and trade went, so went investment capital. In 1999, Congress passed the Financial Services Modernization Act, which ended the Depression-era enforced separation of banking from other financial activities like creating, marketing, and trading financial instruments. In all these instances, the law was catching up with financial reality. Banks and other financial institutions and their lawyers and lobbyists aggressively exploited the fragmentation of government. There are hundreds of state, national, and overseas bodies that separately regulate financial activity to push their permitted boundaries outward. And after each legal change came further changes in the activities and products of the financial industry. Together, what all this amounted to was the creation of bigger, faster, intensely competitive, nationalized or globalized financial institutions that could, on behalf of the highly mobile investment capital they managed, become ever bolder and more imaginative in devising new means of seeking higher returns. New technology was a big part of this story because it permitted enormous advances in the velocity, scale, and sophistication of what was possible in the financial markets. As some of you may know, the huge majority of trading is now automated by algorithm, and this has all happened in the last 5 years, and the average holding time for a trade has gone down into minutes. So that's a somewhat untold story. This was a development of sufficient magnitude as to send a whole series of other economic, social, and political changes cascading across American society and the world. The most immediately visible of these was the appearance of a startlingly different version of Wall Street in the 1980s, one dominated by aggressive investors who repeatedly took apart and reassembled elements of corporate America. This change was a structural one. Thinking about it in terms of fine old gentlemen of the old school being replaced by vulgarians and barbarians isn't very useful. And it was only the beginning of a series of changes of similar magnitude. I don't mean to argue that all these changes were inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. For many decades they didn't happen, and then they did happen. Why? Here, I think the way to look for the answers is by exploring the broader set of ideas that undergird most specific changes at any historical moment. I'll get to these by moving up the ladder of generalities step by step, from policies, such as I've just been discussing, to broader political context, and finally to public philosophy. During the Organization Man era, the American economy was substantially balkanized, both functionally and geographically. The financial system again makes a convenient example, although it isn't the only one. Because of a deep-seated suspicion of concentrated financial power that dates back to the earliest days of the United States, governments at all levels strictly limited the activities of banks, as well as their geographic scope. In return, many players in the financial system were able to live comfortably inside state-protected safe harbors. Think, for example, of the owner of a savings and loan company who had the legal gift of not having to compete for deposits by raising interest rates. The beneficiaries of arrangements like this, golf-playing local earls and viscounts at a time when the country was becoming entranced with the idea of meritocracy, were hard to admire, at least from afar, and the discontent with them was politically ambidextrous. It wasn't just powerful global financial institutions who were disadvantaged by cushy deals like the savings and loan owners. It was also consumers whose interest rate on deposits during the late 1970s was lagging behind the rate of inflation. Academics and journalists often explain the vogue for deregulation in the last quarter of the 20th century as the fruit borne by a well-planned conservative campaign, which began with a memo that Lewis Powell, the future Supreme Court Justice, wrote in 1971, and that peaked when Ronald Reagan took office a decade later. But it's well to remember that some aspects of deregulation had impassioned liberal support. Before President Reagan was a deregulator, President Carter was a deregulator. Another future Supreme Court Justice, Stephen Breyer, as a young staff attorney working for Senator Edward Kennedy, helped persuade Kennedy to make airline deregulation one of his causes. As with the banking system, the airline system was heavily regulated in such a way that a coterie of middlingly competent regional carriers was kept in business by a government agency, the Civil Aeronautics Board, that had to approve all routes and ticket prices and did so in a manner that kept prices high and planes less than full. You know, as I tell this story, I'm thinking everybody over X age will remember this, and to the rest of you it must sound like back in the horse and buggy era, but this actually did happen. Take my word for it. Regulation supporters were most of the incumbent players, the airlines, their Washington lobbying organization, the pilots and bag handlers unions, and the Civil Aeronautics Board's own staff and commissioners, not non-business travelers. Both Ralph Nader on the left and Milton Friedman on the right were all-out advocates of airline deregulation. As Breyer wrote, deregulation was an issue where one could promise concrete achievement, lower prices, regulatory reform, and less government all in one package. Kennedy's hearings on airline deregulation in 1975 led to the passage of a major deregulation law in 1978 and the abolition of the Civil Aeronautics Board in 1985. There were subsequent deregulations of trucking, oil and gas, radio, television, and the telephone system, among others. Now, it's true that some forms of regulation, like environmental, health, safety, and consumer protection regulation, fit the standard ideological categories with the left for them and the right against them. But even in those cases, market mechanisms had become part of the liberal toolkit. Think of cap and trade as a means to limit carbon emissions, or health exchanges as a way of covering the uninsured. But liberals and conservatives alike, everybody except the immediately interested parties, largely abandoned the idea of government handcrafting the structure, the activities, and the prices of specific industries. That seemed to entail depriving what was then a stagnating economy of the dynamism of the market, as well as giving consumers a bad deal. Liberals, and I'm including myself, I enthusiastically embraced this line of thinking at the time, tended not to think of economic regulation as an important cause, and so were rarely vocal in imposing new forms of deregulation, like the latter phases of financial deregulation that after the 2008 financial crash suddenly became high awareness items on the liberal agenda. Economic deregulation was supposed to create innovative new companies to replace the weak older companies that the loss of government protection from competition would drive out of business. Does anybody remember People Express or Windstar, for example? These were the kind of companies that were supposedly going to proliferate. But that has not been its primary effect. The usual result of a generation's worth of deregulation in a business sector was a regime of lower prices and also less service to the consumer, a more concentrated and oligopolistic industry structure, and continued erosion of the old ethic of institutional paternalism as government constraints on business fell away. It's a new world, very familiar to all of us, that some people prefer and some people don't prefer, but it should be understood as representing the replacement of one unofficial but powerful compact in political economy with another, not as something that inevitably had to happen as part of the march of human progress. As we move up the ladder from policies to fundamental principles, again, the standard liberal-conservative distinctions do not neatly apply to the development of the anti-institutional strain that I've been following. It's true that during the last quarter of the 20th century, as the Soviet Union fell and the trade-promoting Washington Consensus was established, the developed world's vision of a good society moved firmly in the direction of the market and away from the state, though in ways that, here in the United States, the more liberal of the two major political parties mainly supported. If you're tracking movement on a different axis, as I'm trying to do here, it's important to understand that the project of creating a new world in which large pools of investment capital attain the maximum possible mobility of time and geography in order to seek the highest returns, the creation of the age of liquidity, to coin a phrase, wasn't universally popular among conservatives, and it wasn't universally unpopular among liberals. As these ideas played out, many previously protected businesses run by loyal Republicans were wiped out, and weren't happy about it, of course, and this strain of conservatism that was oriented primarily toward tradition and stability was pretty well wiped out too. I should just interject, as a Louisianan, most of our politics when I was growing up was, of course, about race. But, it was a very conservative state, and I can tell you no one ever talked about the market, ever, as part of conservatism. When I was a freshman at Harvard, I took a seminar, and there was somebody, this was 1972, and there was somebody in the seminar who was actually the child of two Stanford professors who used the word entrepreneur in the seminar. And I remember feeling this sort of hot blush of shame because I didn't I had never heard that word and had no idea what it meant. And I thought, should I ask? No, I won't ask. I ran home and looked it up in the dictionary, and that was when I learned that there was a thing called an entrepreneur. So that's just by way of saying that conservatism, like liberalism, has many moving parts. Many liberals, in shorthand neoliberals, had come to see groups and institutions as impediments to the liberal project, as I was describing last night. Instead, broad ideas like efficiency and justice, meant to fold the entirety of American or even global society into their embrace, became the overriding goal. Neoliberals thought of the public as a unit, not as an unlovely and highly varied collection of eternally squabbling groups with irresolvably different perspectives, and of the public interest as something that could be discerned and implemented. A righteous cause put on the agenda by an effective and admirable advocate, an activist, a public interest lawyer, a philanthropist, an investigative journalist, and promoted through the techniques of public opinion. That was how society should move, not through politics or bureaucracy or special interest groups. Now, in order to create a society built on such attractive general principles, it was first necessary to abandon the ideal of a society assembled from more particular component parts, interest groups, localities, institutions. That meant replacing pluralism with another theory. The first important modern academic broadside against pluralism as a political model was E. Schachtschneider's The Semi-Sovereign People, published in 1960. Schachtschneider, a penitent former pluralist himself, had embraced the view that big, rich, unshakably secure corporations dominated American life, including political life, in ways that conferred secondary status on all other groups that might have legitimate claims on government. Pluralism didn't work in the way it was supposed to because the balance of power was so much on the side of one set of interest groups. The quote everybody remembers from Schachtschneider's book is, "The flaw in the pluralist heaven is that the heavenly chorus sings with a strong upper-class accent." In 1965, Mancur Olson, a young economist, soon to become a sub-cabinet official in the Johnson administration, published The Logic of Collective Action, a book that is as amiable in tone as Schachtschneider's is dyspeptic, and more relentlessly logical in its critique of pluralism. Schachtschneider, as a political scientist, naturally thought in terms of groups, so his solution to the problem of pluralism was to empower larger groups that felt more like countervailing institutions, political parties being at the top of the list. Olson naturally thought in terms of individual incentives. He argued that pluralism worked properly only for small groups with highly specific economic interests. In such cases, each member of the group has a tangible incentive for participating because political victory would bring an immediate economic reward. Larger and more diffuse groups with broader goals are always less politically effective because they don't have a powerful enough glue to hold their members together, except in cases where members are given no choice, as in a closed-shop labor union. As Olson put it, unless the number of individuals in a group is quite small, or unless there is coercion or some other special device to make people act in their common interest, rational, self-interested individuals will not act to achieve their common or group interests. Therefore, in government, the minor specific needs of small cohesive groups tend to be met, and the larger, more important needs associated with broad national goals tend not to be met. For example, to quote Olson again, often a relatively small group or industry will win a tariff or a tax loophole at the expense of millions of consumers or taxpayers, in spite of the ostensible rule of the majority. Olson thus gave an elegant logical structure to the idea that Washington doesn't work because it is held in a death grip by special interest groups. The most full-bore academic assault on pluralism during this period was Theodore Lowy's The End of Liberalism, published in 1969. Lowy was proud to call his book a polemic directed against what he called interest group liberalism, an evil so powerful that in his view it has caused the United States to cease even to be a democracy. Interest groups, Lowy asserted, take control of the apparatus of government, administrative agencies, congressional committees, and so on, and bend them toward their own needs, which are generally those of what he called organized capitalism. Thus, government winds up supporting rather than combating entrenched privilege. It cannot plan. It cannot meet the real needs of the nation. Broadly speaking, and Lowy was never reluctant to speak broadly, liberal governments cannot achieve justice. That's a quote from him. In a sense, Lowy was offering a left-of-center, government-oriented version of Michael Jensen and William Meckling's principal-agent problem. Justice, in this case, is the principal. Interest groups are the agent, supposed to be acting on behalf of the principal, but actually impeding by virtue of acting on their own behalf instead. The End of Liberalism was very much a book of its time. Even in the 1979 revised edition, published on the verge of a 20-year reign of political conservatism, Lowy barely found conservatism worthy of mention because he was so completely focused on the struggle between all-powerful business interests on one hand and feckless interest group liberalism on the other as the main event in American politics and government. Ironically, Ronald Reagan's first budget director, David Stockman, credited the End of Liberalism with inspiring his youthful switch from liberal to conservative and with providing the template for Reagan's initial regime of big budget cuts in domestic programs. And Newt Gingrich, in his mid-1990s heyday, used to quote from Alvin Toffler's calls for adhocracy instead of institutions and bureaucracy in the same conservative revolutionary spirit. Lowy couldn't conceive of any category of citizens except for fortunate people with entrenched privileges organizing effectively on its own behalf. So that, to use an example much on his mind in the book, urban African Americans would not have been able to function as an interest group. To replace interest group liberalism, Lowy proposed a new system that he called juridical democracy, in which government would set its course on the basis of broad, rational assessments of national needs instead of the political adeptness of interest groups. I will confess that I can't figure out from reading The End of Liberalism exactly how juridical democracy, which Lowy described only briefly at the end of the book, was supposed to work. But shortly after The End of Liberalism was published, John Rawls's A Theory of Justice provided a philosopher's elegant and humane guiding principle for non-pluralist, non-institutional liberalism. One should first extirpate from one's mind any consciousness of one's own interest, and only then, from behind that assumed veil of ignorance, conduct discussions of what government policy should be. This was an especially appealing formulation for the sort of affluent good government liberals who think of themselves as being involved in politics for entirely idealistic, reformist, unself-interested reasons. Rawls-style liberalism entailed advocating on behalf of others who were in need, or on behalf of the whole society, not, except in cases of dire need, on one's own behalf. This idea is so incredibly attractive on first encounter as to be well-nigh irresistible, or at least it was to me. Why not just sweep away the morally inferior, self-protective arguments of those who are trying to hold on to what they have and to stand in the way of progress and simply do what's right? If you live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, as I do, or in Silicon Valley, as you do, you may be personally familiar with a version of this sentiment in which economic efficiency and social justice seem to go together, not to represent two different positions. We'll have free markets, free trade, equal opportunity, and human rights all at the same time. It's a vision of politics that entails solving for a series of single, logical, and morally inarguable variables, one that descends, at least to my mind, from the vision of politics in The Lonely Crowd that I discussed yesterday, with its longing for a reign of principle lodged in the individual conscience instead of the conformist group-based politics that David Reisman saw as prevailing in the United States in 1950. But as you all know, the idea of wise, reasoned governance without respect to interests or institutions has been around for a very long time, at least since Plato proposed putting the affairs of state in the hands of a specially trained and selected class of guardians. And so the arguments against it have been around for a long time too. Even Theodore Lowy admitted that there might be special problems in empowering some body to enact one big set of noble principles upon a society as large and complex as the United States. Referring to the inventor of what's probably the direct forerunner of our idea of the public interest, he observed, Rousseau's general will stopped at the boundary of a Swiss canton. And Lowy acknowledged in proposing his Rousseau-like idea of juridical democracy, quote, at first these proposals may seem to constitute an elitist view of a cure, but it is elitist only in the sense that democracy does have special elitist tendencies. The elite in a democracy is comprised of those persons directly responsible to the largest electorates. John Rawls, who, as Daniel Rogers, the historian, nicely put it, originally imagined that justice could be formulated outside the particular community and particular relationships within which people actually lived, by the end of his life, had amended his theory of justice somewhat so as to create a place of honor for what he called reasonable pluralism. The fundamental problems with governing schemes that attempt to factor out interests in institutions have always been the same. Even under Rawls-like rules in which naked self-interest is inadmissible in discussions about governance, it is very difficult to get people in a large society to agree on how the society ideally should operate. People's fundamental perspectives are simply too different. And any particular group that wants government to do something truly consequential has to frame its argument anyway so that it will attract allies from outside the group. No interest group will get up and say, we're a special interest group, and this is why we want everybody to be on our side. As Rawls put it, by way of explaining the modification of his views, three main kinds of conflicts set citizens at odds: those deriving from irreconcilable doctrines, those deriving from differences in status, class, position, or occupation, or from differences in ethnicity, gender, or race, and finally those deriving from the burdens of judgment. One might add that there is nothing more dangerous than a specially empowered political class that sincerely but wrongly believes itself to be acting on behalf of others or of the society as a whole, while actually, perhaps unconsciously, serving its own interests. As John Dewey wrote back in 1927 in The Public and Its Problems, it is impossible for highbrows to secure a monopoly of such knowledge as must be used for the regulation of common affairs. In the degree in which they become a specialized class, they are shut off from knowledge of the needs which they are supposed to serve. Anyway, who's to say that advocating openly in one's own behalf, especially if one is genuinely on the receiving end of injustice, is morally inferior? Think of the civil rights movement, for example. The passage from Rawls that I quoted a minute ago was obviously written in respectful recognition of the achievements of some of the social movements, such as civil rights and feminism, that had been written out of the picture back in the 1950s. Pluralism was always subtler and more sophisticated than most of its last half-century's worth of critics have been willing to acknowledge. In Federalist No. 10, rather than being starry-eyed about factions, James Madison defined them as being adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. He was looking for ways, as he said, to cure the mischiefs of faction, and the sort of faction that worried him the most was one that represented a majority and thus would find it tempting to impose its will on everyone else. One reason pluralism was so popular in the mid-20th century was that Hitler and Stalin made for vivid examples of the horrors that could befall a society run by a single, supra-democratically empowered elite group motivated by big ideas. In the worst days of the Second World War, Joseph Schumpeter, who I should add parenthetically, it's a real tragedy that all anybody knows of him is two words, creative destruction, and please go read, and there's a lot more there. He declared, "There is no such thing as a uniquely determined common good that all people could agree on or be made to agree on by the force of common argument, because to different individuals and groups the common good is bound to mean different things." The idea that any idealist ought naturally be drawn to the public interest as a governing principle, and that only a cynic could find the relentless squabbling of interest groups in a state capital or national capital appealing, is far too facile. In the caricature version of pluralism, interest groups are always absurdly particular in their concerns and usually business-oriented. To use a contemporary example that everybody loves to hate, think of the notorious sugar lobby, which keeps prices artificially high to the benefit of no one but domestic sugar growers. The high theorists of pluralism, like Arthur Bentley and David Truman, insisted that every citizen belongs to multiple groups in ever-shifting degrees of allegiance, that some groups are economic in their aims and some groups are not, and that unorganized or latent groups whose interests aren't being served by the political system can quickly become organized, active, and effective. Here, again, one might think of the civil rights movement or, more recently, of the Tea Party movement, emerging to everyone's complete surprise in response to the bipartisan government response to the 2008 financial crisis. What pluralists insisted on was that society and politics be understood in terms of groups, not of individuals or, quote, the public, and that a state of political harmony was not possible or even desirable in a democracy. That isn't to say they were blind to the flaws in American politics and society. David Truman ended the governmental process on a rather gloomy note, and one that has resonance today. In a society with increasing inequality of income and wealth, growing separation between classes, and decreasing social mobility, he warned, unorganized groups will feel keenly that government and politics aren't meeting their needs, and they may decide to stop obeying the rules of the game, such as tolerance of civil liberties, open debate, and respect for all groups' rights to full political participation. The great political task now as in the past, he wrote, is to perpetuate a viable system by maintaining the conditions under which such widespread understanding and appreciation can exist. In the loss of such meanings lie the seeds of the whirlwind. Final act. Books that aimed to assess the big changes in American society over the last generation all seem to have titles that communicate the rending of a formerly unified social fabric. Just in the past few years, we've had Charles Murray's Coming Apart, Daniel Rogers' The Age of Fracture, George Packer's The Unwinding, and Mark Mizrucci's The Fracturing of the Corporate Elite, among others. More celebratory books about the current moment, like Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat, or Clayton Christensen's The Innovator's Dilemma, in no way dispute the picture of a society that is being taken apart and reassembled in a new and jarringly unfamiliar form. It's ironic that an intellectual history that began with writers seeing excessive conformity as this country's leading social problem ends with an opposite diagnosis of the national malady, a nation broken into component parts that seem to lack any cultural, economic, or political commonality, and even the ability to bargain with each other in good faith. And, you know, what I think I suppose counterintuitively, is that if we wanted to achieve a sense that the country hadn't broken apart, the way to do it would be to operate through groups and institutions, not by creating a sort of national unity of some kind, which is probably impossible. I've tried to suggest in these lectures that one reason for this unfortunate remaking of America was a change in our way of thinking about the nature of a good society. We began the second half of the 20th century with a rough consensus around the ideal of a country oriented neither primarily toward the individual nor toward the public as a whole, but instead toward groups and institutions. The idea was that people naturally function in groups and groups naturally disagree. So the groups would organize themselves to the point that they could come to institutions, private and governmental, to ask for things, and the institutions would adjudicate their claims. It was only through this process that the market and the state could come into balance. Because endless negotiation and balancing of claims was built into the system, they were not supposed to take place in an atmosphere of bitter acrimony and deep distrust. There was obviously a lot about this ideal to generate dissatisfaction. Groups that hadn't formed potent organizations got ignored. Institutions were treated with an exaggerated respect. Individuals were made to bend too much to the demands of the community. Perhaps most frustrating, at least intellectually, every consequential arrangement represented some kind of compromise between the conflicting demands of groups. Nothing was truly efficient. Nothing had moral clarity. There were too many rules and procedures. Everything moved too slowly. The dream of eliminating these flaws in the mid-century system was powerfully alluring, and it led to a reorienting of American society in many specific ways that, taken together, created the society we have now. I want to stress that, to my mind, this reorienting is not best understood as having been in a liberal or conservative direction. Both liberals and conservatives, once again, participated in it. The overall effect was, as Daniel Rogers wrote, that, quote, power was diminishing, time was foreshortening, structures could be remade in a virtual instant, people were a legible bundle of desires and preferences, choice was on the march. The most important aspect of the reorienting of American society was, prospectively, though certainly not retrospectively, a relatively overlooked one. The freeing of investment capital from its previous constrictions by function, scale, geography, and time. Of the essential elements in a society, capital is by far the most mobile, far more so than people, communities, or institutions. As capital moves around the globe and makes its natural demands, the other elements in society inevitably feel the effects, sometimes happily and sometimes not. I would not state the matter as dramatically as Karl Polanyi did in The Great Transformation, his 1944 book about the Industrial Revolutions having created, to quote him, a catastrophic dislocation in the lives of common people, unquote, that it necessitated the creation of the welfare state. But his formulation does have a good deal of present-day pertinence. To quote him again, a blind faith in spontaneous progress had taken hold of people's minds, and with the fanaticism of sectarians, the most enlightened pressed forward for boundless and unregulated change in society. Human society would have been annihilated but for protective countermoves which blunted the action of this self-destructive mechanism. The connection between our change in ethos and rising inequality seems obvious, at least conceptually obvious, to me. If any of you have ever read Michael Young's 1958 socio-political fantasy, a very weird and unforgettable book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, it's a good place to get the picture of what happens when a society orients itself around a single, noble-sounding variable. The people who are situated so as to excel on that variable begin to prosper far more than everyone else, and that generates a sense of unfairness in everyone else that is as deep and profound as the sense of fairness it generates in the beneficiaries. Our variable, I'm arguing here, is privileging the rights of capital. And the way to conceive of a solution to this kind of social problem is to conceive of our basic social arrangements as compromises, respectfully arrived at among institutions that have organized themselves effectively enough to have influence and staying power. I don't mean to imply that the rise of a more transaction-oriented society has eliminated institutions or interest groups entirely. It has eliminated or weakened some institutions. Mark Bizrucci reminds us that 1/3 of the companies in the Fortune 500 disappeared in the 1980s, the decade when investors succeeded managers as the most powerful force in corporate America. And some interest groups, notably organized labor, have also been substantially weakened. But institutions and interest groups still exist, of course. Microsoft and Amazon and Google and Yahoo may be younger than General Electric and Ford Motor Company, but they're nonetheless big corporations with many component parts, some of which subsidize others, long-term employees, Washington lobbyists, and aspirations to permanence. One of my worries is that in America today, elites who usually don't use a rhetoric that valorizes institutions get to experience all the benefits they can confer, and everybody else has to live with the consequences of our suspicion of institutions' expensive inefficiencies. Students at Stanford enjoy a far richer institutional life than students at Foothill College. The rise of the anti-institutional, anti-bureaucratic, anti-interest group turn of mind has led to insufficient thought being given to the social consequences of rapid institutional change, especially in the United States, where we mistrust government institutions, as David noted, and have historically placed a heavy social burden on large business institutions. Not thinking about institutions also removes the question of concentration of economic and political power from the attention it deserves to have. 100 years ago, there was a heated debate between liberals who mistrusted centralized power in government and business, such as Louis Brandeis and John Dewey, and liberals who were the transaction people of the day, like Herbert Croly and Walter Lippmann, who believed that a strong, expert-staffed national government could successfully check the excesses of the trusts so as to create a good society for all. I heard almost none of this argument in the wake of the financial crisis, which meant that the Lippmann-Crowley side won. We wound up with a significantly more concentrated and significantly more regulated financial industry after the crisis than we had before. I spend a lot of time around transaction people, so I know the depth and certitude of their frustration with older institutions and groups. Why not sweep away the inefficient existing arrangements and just solve the problem? Mancure Olson wrote a book in the 1980s called The Rise and Decline of Nations, which attributed the entire course of history to the ability of entrenched groups to paralyze powerful nations and of instances of their disempowerment, occasionally, to turn second-rate powers suddenly into first-rate ones. You can see evidence of this kind of thinking in the Obama administration's initial impulse to put special czars instead of cabinet secretaries in charge of the most pressing matters before the federal government. You can see it in the deep conviction of many people, especially in the financial and technology industries, that the vast American public education system is broken and that starting over with new, non-union, performance-graded charter schools is the only way to fix it. You can see it in the frustration that people in the human rights and environmental movements have with national governments, and in the widespread belief that philanthropists, non-governmental institutions, and civil society can do a better job at the traditional tasks of the democratic state. Transaction people have wonderfully copious access to all the standard ways of seeking influence. Today's organization people, whose influence lies more in their numbers than in the currency of their ideas, often react to the pace of change and their feeling of exclusion from it by clinging ever more fiercely to what they have: pensions, tenure, trade barriers, and so on, all causes that are as mysterious to transaction people as the agitation for a silver standard was to the progressives 125 years ago, or by turning to populism, which seems to be on the rise throughout the developed world. Few institutions can completely deny the charge that they are at least somewhat inefficient, rule-bound, and slow to change. From a social point of view, that's part of the purpose of institutions. Most of them have to operate at the provincial, mundane level at which most people live out their lives. They can, and sometimes do, aim to provide a sense of continuity, purpose, and fairness, what Karl Polanyi called social protection, an essential benefit that includes but is not limited to economic well-being, which efficiency, mobility, and big ideas are not always so good at providing. Institutions create a degree of what the psychologist Barry Schwartz calls friction as a counterweight to the pure, fast force of the market. Treating them with respect and using them as a first resort in devising responses to new problems and old needs is the best way to build a good society, and one that we need to rediscover. I hope you haven't heard these lectures as an exercise in nostalgia. Even if I were personally nostalgic for the era I described in yesterday's lecture, which I don't think I am, all social prescriptions that entail a restoration of conditions that existed at a period in the past are doomed to failure because history doesn't have a reverse gear. The corporation-dominated society of mid-20th century America is gone forever, and along with it, the economic security of very large businesses, their ability to distribute some of that security to their employees is gone forever too. In democratic societies, if the basics of well-being are threatened, people will demand them, often in ways that seem out of date and impractical to transaction people. The pleasure of living in a highly fluid society simply is not universally experienced. A great project of the years to come will be the playing out of these demands. This can proceed in any number of ways, through an enhanced welfare state, through conflict and democratic dysfunction, or through some other set of possibilities. But if we can begin to think of groups and institutions, some of which may be new ones, but none of which will be entirely fluid, as the best of the tools available to us for executing the project, that will maximize the chance of a happy result. That's it. Thank you.